Thank you everyone for joining us here today. We have a global panel, and many of you are joining us from in and around the center of this webcast, which is Kuala Lumpur here in Malaysia. For those of you having trouble logging in, it may be because we are having a lot of people joining in this call. So what you could do is you could join the FB link or Facebook link that we're sharing with you right now on the screen. If you see this link, or if it's in the chat box, then you could click that if you're having trouble, or someone you know is having trouble getting in. Share that with them. At this point, ESG TV would like to thank its event partner and gender consultancy, as well as our media partner, Rentak Sejuta, who is cross-streaming this live event on their Facebook page as well. Here's the link for everyone on this Zoom session right here. If you could share that with friends and family who want to be on this call. In the chat box, please feel free to leave your views and your opinions. Most importantly, your questions. We want to hear from you. I'll try to take them and pose these questions to our panelists as much as I can when I can, but please leave them there for me to see. Now, today's dialogue seeks to highlight social inequalities, a grave reality happening in many countries which remain hidden from the climate debate, and we want to look at what are the fundamentals to build better. So this discussion will take lead from two researchers that was conducted by Path Foundation in the Philippines and Penita Initiative in Malaysia, of which we'll be sharing some video footage with you shortly. Now, as they say, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed, experienced, and expert panel here today. I say this because some are volunteers, but all of them are passionate about what they do. They spend time, effort, money, blood, sweat, tears to make a difference and to bring these issues up to light. So I'm thoroughly excited to be joined by, firstly, on our panel of speakers, Dr. Joan Castro. Welcome, Doctor. Doctor has more than 20 years of experience on a range of sustainable and community development initiatives in rural and urban settings. She's an advocate and practitioner of cross-sectoral approach in health, population, gender, and environment, including livelihood and economic dimension. Now, although most of her experience is based in the Philippines, she's also worked with various organizations in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as in Africa. And right now, she's currently the Executive Vice President of the Path Foundation of Philippines. If we have a video of Doctor, perhaps we could take a quick look at that video right now.
The women of Sarawak in Malaysia and Mindoro in the Philippines are no different. Climate change has taken a toll on their communities, and the women are burdened the most. In Mindoro, there is a decrease of fish catch caused by climate change and an increase of childbirth, creating an imbalance with the fishing community's needs, as the lack of family planning creates a vicious cycle of poverty and leaves them vulnerable to disasters.
Fishermen, the fisher households where we conducted the study in Oriental Mindoro have bigger families, so they're even above the average family members of 4. They go as many as having 7 children. And fishers being the most vulnerable, partly because they're also the poorest of the poor, dependent on the coastal resources, are most affected by climate change because of the decreased fish that they get and that they catch, which is the main source of food and livelihood of the fisher households.
With population growth in rural areas, the need for the awareness on sexual health among these areas are a necessity. With less fish coming in causing less income, families are not able to provide for their children's needs, including their education. In return, their children end up with the same hardship that their parents have gone through, taking over the same jobs, leaving the community in a continuous vicious cycle that wouldn't be sustainable in the future.
And this is part of a research and an effort highlighting sexual and reproductive health and rights in areas in Philippines and in Malaysia. Next on the panel, I'd like to bring in Professor Nadaraja. He's the chair professor at the Xavier Center of New Humanities and Compassion Studies at Xavier University in Bhubaneswar in India. Now, at the center, among the key areas in compassion studies, Professor explores the deep relationship between sustainability and spirituality. Super interesting, working towards a interfaith and civic engagement framework. As hard as that may sound, he's also a member of the Asian Public Intellectuals API community, and Professor is also an independent public sociologist and commentator. Next, I'd like to bring in Chanda Tampa. She belongs to the Magar indigenous community in Nepal, and she's currently working as the Deputy Secretary General at the Asia Indigenous People Pact, or AIPP, based in Chiang Mai, Thailand. She holds more than 15 years of long experience working with people's rights, women's rights, gender, peace building in areas in Nepal and in Asia. Next on, I'd like to also introduce and bring in Sunita Bisan from Malaysia, who's very passionate about gender equality, climate change, and ecology. She believes in the potential of individuals and communities to build a humane, environmentally sound, and peaceful existence. She's an independent researcher and a consultant. And also joining us today is Helen. She's calling us from one of the rural sites. So we may have her come in intermittently, but we hope that she'll be able to hang on to the connection that is in her area. She belongs to the Iban community in Sarawak, and that of course is an indigenous community where she is an activist. She has over 20 years of experience advocating for people's rights in various issues from land rights to rivers. And in particular, Helen is passionate about women empowerment in Sarawak. We want to share with you right now a visual just for all our visual understanding of the project site of which the research was based on. We're going to play this video for you. So let's all have a look.
Oke, yang pertama karena itu adalah hak kami lah untuk mempertahankan tanah adat. Itu adalah salah satu sumber pencarian ataupun makanan kami di sini. Yang ketiga karena untuk anak cucu kemudian tidak kalau mereka orang buat dam itu kan untuk anak cucu kemudian tidak ada lah. Dua duman ini menduman 2010 telok di oke sikit. Tenan 2024 tang 2025 ini si jadi bidang buat ke kenan cuaca lang am sayu. Si lelo hayo kenap tak tubuh tak am sayu nure. Abi nu si tak jam hasil hadu tak pa kenap kuman buat tapi pa buka usi pi jadi nure tu sahlalan cuaca lang am sayu nuni.
Ayo kerennya susah ai duman 20 duman sisu katah tala tang 10 duman ulalau ke senang tala tu jakanan kereni susah lah susah teh lawa bin kereni ke kira utasa na tuan ke kenan company ni ka kenan nun ka tasa na tusah teh lo barang awi way ni ke awi kat nun na lang gunah ta na keperluan ta.
And on the list, finally, but not least, is the very young and passionate Sophia Sidaras. She's an Indigenous rights and environmental youth activist. Her activism has brought her traveling throughout Canada and even on the international stage. Sophia, we're proud of you at the UN headquarters for the International Day of the Girl. Full of spunk. I love your spirit, and of course, you have so much experience to share with us as well. She has explained the importance of Mother Earth in relation to her community of women and girls. And she's also, mind you, one of the 15 plaintiffs suing the Canadian government for inaction on climate crisis. So, ladies and gentlemen, across the globe joining us today, climate change is, of course, a reality that is occurring faster than predicted. The number of people suffering hunger has increased. Inequality is increasing as we speak within and among countries. And now add on a pandemic as well. So the setback is tremendous. And I'd like to bring in our speakers on towards today's discussion to weigh in and set the scene for us today on their findings and persistence of what's going on at the grassroots level and the injustice and inequality that they see and hear of in their course of work. So welcome to my panelists of speakers. Thank you again for being here today. I leave this an open-ended question as well. Who would like to jump in first? But the question directly is, as we look at everyone terming what the new normal is post or while we're going through COVID-19, we've all set our ears and eyes on this term, the new normal. We don't even know what that means, but we've set that, the new normal. But let's pause for a minute, take stock of what the reality is, and look of what's happening. And that is the existing abnormal, or rather a normal that never even was for these communities. And then you add on the burden of the new normal for these communities who've been affected by climate change. So panelists, what's going on at the grassroots level from where you are at, what you have seen, and we want to weigh in on all of that. Perhaps I can start with you, Dr. Joan.
Hello, Jessie. What's happening right now, if you, having worked with women in rural communities, the first thing that you see is actually loss of livelihood. And women being carers of their homes, that translates to the health, the status of nutrition in the family. So you would see the effect of already marginalized community. And I say this because we've been working with women in coastal areas. And in the Philippines, fisheries, the fisheries sector is already the most vulnerable of the communities. And pre-COVID, they are already working very hard. You see them in the middle of everything, having all the work that they have to do, working overtime for their families and for their children. So essentially, an additional pressure with COVID is taking additional toll to these women who dreams of better lives for their children. So you see the impact, both the emotional and the pressure that they have right now.
Sophia, what are some of the experiences you have had and the reality that you are seeing right now on the ground?
So in Canada, we already had our environmental acts and laws somewhat in place. The enforcement of these environmental laws in Canada are not being enforced on the ground, even without a pandemic. But with this pandemic, what we are seeing is the relaxing of these laws. Therefore, pipelines and other natural resources can be pushed through Indigenous lands without consent, at a greater risk to Indigenous women and girls on the ground. And we also see a higher rate of police brutality without consequence because of the lack of structure in this time in a pandemic, especially when all the media attention is around how many new cases of COVID every day and financial support to families, Canadian families that need it most, which of course is great, but the point is that our normal as Indigenous peoples in Canada was already significantly tragic, and now with this pandemic, we see media not covering as much the tragedies that are happening in our communities. However, in the US, with the focus on racial inequality and Black Lives Matter, we have a spotlight now in Canada, and we have a lot of tragedies happening that are now getting coverage because of what's happening in the States. So we have that influence in our medias, which is good, but definitely with the pandemic, the inequalities on Indigenous communities is getting worse.
Yeah. Well, that is the reality happening right now. We want to, of course, feature more of that in our points of discussion to come. Perhaps, Chanda, I could sort of point and pass the baton on to you right now to tell us a little bit more of what you see in your course of work.
Okay, thank you. If we talk about this abnormal situation for Indigenous peoples across the globe, they have never experienced any normal situation. So they are the most unequally treated groups all over the world. So that's, I think we already heard from the experience from Canada, our friend from Canada. So there is, in Asia, there is almost like 411 million Indigenous people in Asia. But if you talk about the rights being ensured to these communities is very, very negligible, because only 5 countries in Asia have recognized them as Indigenous people. So this also shows the non-recognition status of Indigenous peoples has very heavy impact in terms of experiencing or sharing the benefits from the state as Indigenous people. So if you see, there is also very high poverty rate in Asia, where they are one of the poorest communities across the world. If you see in Myanmar, in Thailand, there is pretty much in control by the military. Cambodia is still under this de facto one-party rule, and Laos, Vietnam, China, they are still under this de jure. So, these situations are very much affecting to the rights of enjoying the rights of Indigenous peoples. Like if you see in past 3 decades, that has shown very fast economic growth, leading to rapid exploitation of natural resources and land conversion to agro industrial plantations. So in most of the countries, and if you see these big mega projects, development projects in almost all the Asian countries, are also being operationalized in the Indigenous territories, Indigenous land. So that means Indigenous peoples from these countries are the most affected communities, because they are facing this land grabbing, displacement, this land disposition. There are resettlement programs, but they are not appropriate from the Indigenous communities. So so most of the Indigenous communities have lost the control over their land, territories, and resources, and they don't have their own decision over the self-determined development. So that's some of the very concerning situation for Indigenous peoples. And if you talk about climate change, then Indigenous peoples have very little contribution to climate change. But if you see the impact over these communities, then they are the one disproportionately, impacted. And if you talk about Indigenous women, they are the one, facing this multifold of discrimination, based on their ethnicity. At the same time, the burden of climate change are also the one that women are facing. So I think there is also very there is big gap and also lack of enabling environment for the full and effective participation in the decision-making processes of climate change. So either at the national level, regional level, international level. So this has also left behind, we talk about this SDG, no one left behind, but Indigenous communities are the one, they are left far, far behind. So At the same time, I think the state are also like not really, like recognizing the status of indigenous peoples. At the same time, we are also facing a lot of this climate change impact on these climate refugees. So that's also not been recognized. Most of the indigenous communities, they are like migrating, voluntary migration are happening because they don't have any option than migration. So these issues are also not being, and this is happening in most of the indigenous communities, and then they are facing the like impact at a much more higher level. Yeah.
Thanks, Chanda. I'd like to now bring in Sunita Bisan as well as Helen from the Malaysian perspective. If we have any visuals, we can play in the background as well. For context, we can try to roll that. But Sunita and Helen, please weigh in on what you're seeing and the grave realities happening with these communities in this part of the world. Sunita?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just muted myself. What do you call this? First of all, let me thank Jessie for giving me that question, but let me thank the ESG TV for their interest in our work. I think that for us is in somehow it's a mixed reaction, in a sense that we are happy to see the importance of the research, but we are also saddened that as we look back and we look now, there is a lag in action by so many to address these fundamental issues as affecting the lives of communities and the lives of women in these communities. Before I go on to give my take on the matter, I would like to thank a few people here. First of all, Helen, for her work for bringing in the community and the women leaders at Sarawak to share their stories and to share this change that they need in terms of narratives in the development sector and the change of narratives within the UNCCC is important. Secondly is our other colleague, Goai, who kept us on track with our deliveries, for Arrow for financing us and sourcing the finances to make this possible. Joan here, thank you for sourcing the financing to visualize our work. I think that had been a very critical element for us. And I think both Joan and I think Joan will share with me here. We would like to thank Inshallah Montero. Inshallah did a wonderful, wonderful work, capturing what we have written in words and putting it into this perspective for us to even have this discussion 5 years on, right? For me, I will speak in terms of this research, and I'll let Helen discuss what has happened or what is happening right now, based on the pandemic situation. But the research, I think, is important, not only in terms of Malaysia, but in terms of the 7 other countries that we have all had the same research focus, highlighted there was no normal to begin with. What we normalize in our world is we've normalized inequality. We've allowed the extension of extraction of our natural resources. We've allowed for communities, whether it's indigenous communities, whether it's fisher folk, whether it's women who are farmers, we've allowed inequality and extraction of resources that deprives them from fulfilling their fundamental human rights, basically. The second thing is I would like to thank Arrow, actually. They're the one, and also Joan here, to put on the SRHR framework. Because in my work, I work on gender mainstreaming, right? And using this SRHR framework is important in the sense that it helped me highlight and help me build a conversation on the importance of intersectionality, the importance of having an intersectional approach in gender mainstreaming. And what this means is that we're not just doing gender to just close gaps between men and women, okay? And that binary approach. We are actually looking at how people experience barriers. We are looking at how things like their race, their gender identity, their ability in terms of socioeconomic status, their age, intersects with how they live their lives. And if we are going to pursue this meaning of equality, it has to recognize and meets all these diverse needs. So if you ask me this question, post-COVID or with this COVID, what is important is that the COVID pandemic made it clear that we are all a human family. Yeah. And what is important that if we now going to take this new opportunity to rebuild, all these researchers shows that we cannot build on a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. It doesn't work. It actually alienates or it excludes a lot of communities, and these are communities like Chanda mentioned, actually had very little contribution to climate degeneration. In fact, they are the ones who are protecting the ecosystem for us. And we are dismissing them with such an easy swipe of your actually from your, even those of us who are on the internet and doing this, online stuff. You just swipe of your cursor, you ignore them. In the UN system also, these voices and these narratives never get into the mainstream. So it is important that we bring this forward and we bring inclusiveness at the forefront of our building better. That's what I want to say.
Thanks, Nita. Helen, I believe Helen's on the call as well right now.
Yeah, she's on my WhatsApp right now. Yeah, but she's also made a video because just in case.
Do you think we could play that video right now, Louise, if that's possible, just for everyone to also understand the perspective Helen's coming from?
Yeah, because Helen's is in a village right now and the internet is a wee bit wonky. So we apologize for that. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Helen. I'm working with one of the local NGOs before. Unfortunately, we are closed already. It was called BRIMAS, Borneo Resource Institute Malaysia. So regarding the issue that we discuss now is about the indigenous women's participation. Of course, last time we tried to educate them so that they're able to bring some of the indigenous women attending some meeting, trainings, and so on. But after we are no longer exist at Sarawak, I can see the voices of the women is very slow. We can't hear any voices from the indigenous women at Sarawak. We never saw any statement from the indigenous women. We didn't see any campaigning regarding the indigenous women rights in Sarawak. Unfortunately, we also unable to help them since most of the activists will bring their own works to continue survive Sarawak. So meaning that the platform for the indigenous women at Sarawak is no longer exists. As we know that the indigenous women at the rural area, I'm talking about the local rural area indigenous women, of course there is many weaknesses because there are lack of knowledge, communication. There also lack of capacity building, since most of them stay quite far from the urban area. Okay, there is no facilities. The road access also not easy for them to bring them to the urban. So since their life is getting worse after they lost their forests, the impact of the development and so on, it's more hard for them to live in the forest, in their place and then in their long house. Because once there is no one give them any knowledge about their rights anymore. Nobody is bringing them to make any actions to protect their lives, their rights. And the third thing is, no one can guide them anymore in Sarawak. So I can see that the situation is become worse if compared to before. Okay, we think that Malaysia is a developing country, and we are the better countries is compared to others. But for me, we still have a big problem. We're still facing a big problem, especially for the indigenous women. So, in terms of participation also, I can say that since most of the younger women, after finish their primary school level at the village, they will migrate to the urban area to find a proper life, so that they can get good knowledge, they can get a better livings, and so on. The rest of the indigenous women who still stay in the village will become worse. Why I'm saying that? Because they can't do anything. They can't do anything. They're facing a big problem right now. The climate change, the forest is lost, totally lost, and then their health also, their knowledge about their rights is nothing. So once they live alone, they can't do anything more, and it's become worse lah. Okay. And then another thing is, if we want to speak on their problem, it's better that we can bring their own to speak, not the NGOs. Otherwise, the government itself will condemn us, saying that the statement is come from the NGOs. They make their own statement. So better if we can bring these indigenous women from the local communities, from the rural area, to speak on their own word. Okay? And then the next point is, I want to highlight here is, the platform for them is very important. Who will going to guide them, educate them, empowering them after this? First. Second, let them speak on their own. Okay. If there is a problem, we can assist them in terms of documentation and so on. But to speak, the voices must from them. And the third thing is, this is the grassroots level. They don't understand the international things, the rule and regulation from the international things. It's good that we start from the beginning. I mean, from the local, from the grassroots level, so that they can understand slowly. Okay, and then please lah, we need to help them in doing some action. For the NGOs program, I can't say anything. I don't have any comments, since that is the biggest challenges in Sarawak right now. Okay, politicians, they can't take any action.
Helen, perhaps you could share your perspectives as well, coming from the Iban community. Tell us exactly, what are the daily troubles that the communities who are sidelined face with the effects of climate change, as they're victims of inequality as well. Please paint us that picture for all of us to understand.
Okay. This is for the information to all of us. What is the situation at Sarawak right now among the rural area indigenous women? Basically, now we're facing a problem to get a better platform to address the problems and also the voice of the indigenous peoples, because you only can find a few of the activists, and there's no longer NGOs exist at Sarawak who is really can help and guide these people to speak out about their rights, to do some campaigning works and so on. I mean, the platform is very important here. Unfortunately, since our Prime Minister announced that Malaysian is a development countries, our funders thinking that we don't need this help anymore. So, because I used to work with Primas, one of the NGOs, local NGOs, in 2014, that is the last funding that we get from the funders. And then that is the last action that we take and the last work we done for the community itself. So it's not there because we no longer exist in Sarawak anymore. Until also you hear in voices from the indigenous women, there is something like so quiet and very sad. Time to time, the situation is become worse. But there is no platform and nobody can address, can speak and tell everyone what is happening in Sarawak. So that is a very bad situation in Sarawak.
Yeah, it seems to me that although there are policies in place and there's a lot of talk, but when it comes to grassroots level, the enforcement of action is lacking. I'd like to bring in now a professor who's joining us from Xavier University. Professor, welcome to the panel as well. Thanks for taking time. Perhaps you could also weigh in on your perspective of what is the current situation in areas of where you have seen your experiences with, and also you have a very interesting perspective of sustainability meeting spirituality. And I think if I go back and if I could quote really a quote from a Native American proverb, it says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And that is so powerful. And perhaps you could weigh in on your perspective.
The discussion we are having on inequality and climate change, I think, and now the pandemic, I think it's all coming out from the same kind of context. You know, you call it liberal, new liberal order, you call it predatory capitalism, vampire capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But I think that is the source of all these problems. So in our analysis, if you do not look at that, then
okay, I think we have lost Professor in this short time here. Do apologize for the technical glitches. It is, after all, a new era. And so let me come back to our panelists right now, all our speakers, and please weigh in at any point of time. I'd like to go back to the SGD goals. To fulfill these goals, it seems right now a far-fetched idea, especially when there have been 17 goals set. And when we look at today's topic, how many and so many of these goals that are set there need to be met in order for inequality to be erased completely. If we look at SGD's goal number 10, to reduce inequality, how and what are some steps that we can take while we are aware of the problem at hand, and while we know that there are policies that need to be reformed, authorities that need to be re-educated, changes that need to take place? What can be done short term and long term to help move or progress towards creating a more sustainable reality for these communities? Dr. Joan.
Leadership is very important. It's because if you have a good leadership that is committed to help the marginalized, and in the work that we do would be the women, particularly the fishers, that would be very critical to ensure that the short-term goals, the inequalities that the women and the marginalized communities are experiencing, they will be able to adapt and be more resilient to climate change. The other thing that's important is to empower the communities to be self-reliant and be able to take care of themselves, because most of the times, like the research that we did with Sunita, is that the projects are short-term. So you are only able to build capacity to some extent, but the leadership and the governance system and the institutions need to be able to institute enabling policies and programs that will sustain the gains of what projects have instituted over the process. So that's always the cycle that's happening. There are programs that are successful, but then you are able to address only a little bit of the multifactorial reasons why there is inequality. And for families, for communities that you work with, usually the most important that you need to address would be the food on the table, the education for their children. No matter how poor these communities are, they have big dreams for the future of their children. And I think that is a very strong anchor that leaders, wherever they come from the government, from the non-government organizations, to be able to meet and address those needs, those basic needs that
Sophia, do you agree with what Dr. Joan is saying? Because while we see policies trying to take place and we're trying to convince corporations to be more, involved, just this week, you had an incident happen. I'm sure that also had changed your perspective. If you could share that experience and then also share your point of view on the question.
Yeah, well, I do agree with Joan that basic needs need to be met, and that leadership should be paying attention to those basic needs in Indigenous communities. And women and children are obviously most vulnerable in those Indigenous communities that are already vulnerable. The incident that you were talking about was a federal police shot one of my members in my community. And therefore that police brutality that we are seeing in our communities also reflects the stance of the colonial governments in Canada, in the US, and across the world. Colonialism has had such an impact on Indigenous communities, which is also related to their economic agenda, which is capitalism, which is also related to climate change and how they treat our lands, and that reflects how they treat us in the end. So for me, you can't really separate climate change from capitalism, from colonialism. It's all the same issue, and we need to address how they treat Indigenous peoples, their mindset and their biases, in order to address the other global crisis, which is climate change. And nobody is really focusing on that global crisis. We're all focusing
Sophia,
on that.
you say no one is focusing, but across the globe there are NGOs, there are corporations who then park it under their CSR efforts, who are trying, and I say in inverted commas, quote unquote, trying. And then there's this issue of people say, well, I'm young, well, what can I do? But so are you. And so what can youth do, your peers, your contemporaries? What can they do? Do they take to social media? Do they go on the ground? What can be done? Because corporations waiting for governments to make changes, that is there, but it seems like a long-term plan. What can be done by the people?
The people have the ultimate power in the end. I've always thought that, and I've always seen it throughout history, and it still remains true to this day. I mean, nothing really ever gets done until the people speak out and do something about it. So for the young people that have been gathering internationally with the Greta Thunberg movement, with the Fridays for Future strikes, it is peaceful, but it tells our leaders all over the world that we are watching and that we're not going to accept anything less than a sustainable future. And it is important to connect the inequalities of marginalized communities in the global climate crisis. So for youth to actually have a stance on it, not be neutral, and to show their support, whether that's physically if they can, in the streets or on social media, it's really important to vocalize that opinion that you have, because if you don't say anything, they take that as if you're on their side, and they meaning, you know, the colonial entities that have already been successful with destroying indigenous lands and destroying a sustainable future for all youth across the world.
I want to move on to Sunita and Helen, simply because location-wise and experience-wise, there are similarities. I want to also zoom in into the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights and the term body politics. Sunita?
Well, well, I use that. Okay. I think what is important right now is to understand, and taking also from what Sophia is saying, is how we have been culturalized, or we've been normalized on how women and identity is being captured, both by corporation, both by the government. And what is also important is that we also need to understand that we have linkages, whether it's in terms of our health or our children's and our families. We need to have access to these resources. And many of these communities that we work with, and this is what I echo again, what Joan has brought up, is that they are resilient. But the way we conduct development, the way that we running right now, in fact, the country and our governance, we are creating situation that removes their independence. We are creating situation that removes their ability to be resilient. And I would like to beg to differ, you know, Jessie. I do understand that corporation and governments are doing quite a lot of work in terms of the SDGs. And yes, of course, we would like to say that we need more. But it is not just we need more. If you can see how much we have locked down just because of COVID-19 pandemic, why can't we lock down? Because we have done so much devastation to the environment and our ecology. You know, we had that commitment to just do so much in the last 3 months. Don't forget, the last 3 months, we have locked down the entire world. We have shifted people's lives. And yet we can't shift our mindset to have a more ecocentric view that we need our environment. We don't need corporate bailout. We need more bailout to help and keep our forests. You know, we need those things. And let's understand the gravity of how exclusion works and how it intersects and, you know, it connects with climate justice.
Sunita, please, I'd like to hold you to that. Please tell us and explain to us, because for many of us, we only read what the media tells us. We don't have first-hand experience like you do. Take us to the scene, tell us.
Yeah, okay, I will tell, because Helen is away and we've been talking, and that's the reason why we've agreed to come with ESG on this. And one thing that she has told us, you know, the lockdown had locked down a lot of villages. And we had created an economy that allows for community to buy things from outside, but never allowed them to grow the things, you know. The deforestation caused so much temperature rise. Land has been taken away, like Chanda has said, from indigenous communities, that they are not able to even grow their own food. They are not able, it's just crazy right now. And you're just putting them into a situation that they have no food security, they have no physical security in terms of where they're living. And it's just overwhelming. What Helen is saying in terms of we need funding to go to the community, because these women need help. They need connection in terms of health services. They need connection in terms of helping them build their food security. They need their forests. They don't need deforestation. They don't need another mall or street mall or whatever in their area. They need their forests and their land to grow food. And they're growing. But the thing is that it's not enough. It really is not enough. And a lot of the experiences that we are talking about happened 5 years ago. And I just cannot imagine what is happening now. And a lot of the communities right now, they are just cut off, and it's hard. It's hard for them. But you asked a very simple question just now, which is actually a very hard question for us to answer, is how can we recalibrate our values? And I have Prof. Nat right now on my WhatsApp. And I think that this is a very important, and it's an important feature if we're going to rebuild our future. It's not something we can move forward without doing. So I don't know, Prof, can you hear me and can you speak?
Yes, it'd be good to have Prof back on the matrix.
I think we need to see these connections, you know, between, you cannot separate climate issues with strong inequality. You cannot separate inequality and climate with the pandemic we are facing. Is all part of this same, they are instances of how the system has worked. And the way the system has, developed, giving rise to all these kinds of problems, I think is what we need to examine, because it is not just a problem of material issues, but also moral issues. It's a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual problem in a sense, because we have so much of growth, we have so much of material development, which is actually skewed, and we do not really know how to take care of this material wealth. We do not know how to take care of our growth. These are actually spiritual issues, and we need to address
Prof,
that.
if you could hear me, and if I could interject at this point, Professor.
So coming from there,
I would like you to really highlight, I think it's so important for us to understand the relation between sustainability and spirituality. How do you come to that conclusion?
Exactly. One minute, Jesse. I think you're getting it too narrow and no focused. This is a really big problem. You cannot, this whole idea of disciplinarity, thinking very narrow to sustainability, spirituality. I think these are all interconnected issues. Whether it is climate issue or whether it is inequality or the pandemic, they're all interrelated issues. So if you're addressing a problem, I think it should be really holistic. And in terms of strategy, I think we need to work across movements, across platforms. We can't just focus on climate issue or cannot focus on equality and think that we can solve the problem. We're not going to solve the problem. I mean, we've been having this kind of discussions for so many years. We still haven't. The world has only got worse, and the pandemic has shown how worse it's got. So in terms of the relationship between sustainability and spirituality, it comes from a moral crisis that we are faced with. It's not just a material crisis. It's not a. It's a question of justice, question of equitable distribution. It's a question of not just looking at poverty, but looking at affluence. Our affluence is actually hurting us. It's investigating affluence. So if you look at the whole picture, then I think one would arrive at a kind of a moment, a spiritual or compassionate deficit moment. I mean, we have pushed the world into such an extent that we have lost our direction, we have lost our spirituality, we have lost our empathetic compassion towards other people, towards nature, towards other life. And therefore, we have to find a way back to nature. And to find way back to nature it's not an easy thing. To find way back to nature also means that we look at these values. We look at how do you build a compassionate world. So the way I like to frame this whole thing is that we are faced with a moral crisis, a spiritual crisis, and it is a crisis of that is coming from a kind of development that we have been, involved with directly or indirectly, that has created all these things. So if you're looking at solutions, you're looking at how to deal with it. We cannot just say, okay, I will look at climate issues. I can look at inequality issues. Or I look at pandemic issues. I don't think we're going to resolve anything of that. So, I mean, to put a position
so,
is that
Prof, if you could offer your
as a cross-platform movements and action in terms of looking at everything in its interconnectedness, rather than to looking at it in specific, specialized areas. I don't think that's going to help us. I mean, that is my first submission. I have a number of other things I can say, but I will stop there.
I've been warned that we don't have enough time. We have 7 minutes on the official clock. We may extend this conversation, but now I want to go to Chanda in Nepal. Chanda, you've been quiet for quite a while. Do tell us what, in your opinion, is some of the actionable solutions possible for the work that you do and what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think I just want to go back to this whole perspective of development. And then I think there is a very fundamental question that we always been asking is development for whom? Development for what cost? So, because if you talk about indigenous people, so we are always demanding for self-determined sustainable development, which has completely been neglected, in all the processes. So at the same time, this development also has been looked into a very narrow perspective of economic growth. And then all this, if from the perspective of economic growth, and that it's again having more negative impacts, I already shared a lot about, how it has been impacted, losing of land, ancestor land, and then impact of climate change, all those points. We're still struggling to be recognized as an individual, as a community, because if you see the SDG goals, that still it's not recognizing or it's not addressing even the disaggregated data based on ethnicity. So even we have been struggling to ensure that there should be data for indigenous people based on ethnicity. So that's one of the things. I think when we talk about this SDG goals, if you talk about goal 16, it's about peace, justice, and strong institution. But in most of the countries, we have seen that the state is not being able to respond to the needs and priorities of its own citizens. So I think we have tremendous example we all have been experiencing. So At the same time, when we talk about gender equality, so I think even recent case of the COVID pandemic, so I think the violence against indigenous women, the domestic violence has been emerged as one of the biggest issue. So recently there was an case in Nepal where a woman was raped in a quarantine center. So you can see the very, like aggravated like situation, like violence against indigenous women, indigenous peoples, it's like massively there. But at the same time, we are also taking some, taking some positive steps to be as a learning for us, because in many countries there are some aspects we are positive. For example, in Philippines, the Indigenous Peoples' Right Act, it's, I think we consider as a radical, although implementation is quite weak. In India, the Forest Right Act, like is also one of them. So in Malaysia, we have this community protocol. So I think there are some quite positive steps also we can see. And also at the international level, the UN agencies, other INGOs are also taking forward. And they are also like adopting the policies on indigenous people. So that is also some positive aspects we can see. And at the same time, in the context of Myanmar, I think we are quite, like positive, and it also has raised hope towards indigenous peoples in Myanmar, that the new land use policy, that's in the process of drafting. So I think these are some of the aspects we can see, and we can also see like increased number of indigenous people's engagement in the international processes, including women. So recently, not recently, but yeah, we have one indigenous woman from Philippines, Grace Balawang. So she is being elected as International Indigenous Peoples Forum Climate Change representative. And at the same time, indigenous women from Nepal, she is now representing as in the facilitative working group. So I think there are also some positive things, like we are not thinking about all those, like frustrating things, but also some positive aspects. So what we want actually is to ensure the recognition and respect, protect of the indigenous collective rights of indigenous people. So that's one of the main like demand. And then I think as everyone enjoys, indigenous people should also be able to enjoy equal rights as a citizen of the country and live a dignified and just life. Yeah.
Can I share one little thought?
Professor, is that you trying to? Yes, Professor? Oh, Professor's on the phone. Okay, I'll come back to our panelists. We don't have much time on the clock. In summary, if I could go through each and every one of you as to what you've seen, obviously that we've discussed that, but ultimately, how do we call for action, and what are the changes that can be made immediately, or what are the roles we can play immediately to bring about change? That is the objective of today's discussion, today's dialogue, to really call out on changes and actionable items. Sophia.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, just really quickly, it really is the people that will determine what path we go on. Governments are not responsive to the Sustainable Development Goals. They have been in place. We have until 2030 to get there. And I don't think we will get there based on how we're approaching the issues. And all the issues are not intersectional, right? A lot of the issues that Chanda and Sunita and Joan and the professors have mentioned, these issues with the women and marginalized communities, indigenous communities, and climate change, they're not protected enough. Governments are not taking enough action, and it's the people that will need to take action, and that's what will determine our future and the youth's future.
Dr. Joan?
From all these crises, from all the difficulties that the communities have seen, I think we've learned enough. And what we've learned from it is that we are not going to be able to address all these inequalities if they're going to be addressed in some goes. And I think that has been the discussion in this whole situation. The women, the fishery, the communities need to be resilient, and we need to provide them with services on sexual and reproductive health, not only on health, services that would help them to build their resources, which is where they get their food and livelihood. So they need all of these services to be able for them to be resilient now and in the future. Climate change, they know that it's not going to stop right now. It's going to continue, so that their struggle being in the middle of all of these issues. We need integrated approaches on population health and environment to be able to make them capable of responding to these issues, at least at their own level. And we hope that the government will pick up on that.
Sunita?
Yeah. Well, like Joan says, and I echo the similar thing, that we have enough research on the ground, at the ground level. We have enough evidence. We need more action. And like Chanda said, it begins with recognition. We need to recognize everyone has rights, and there is a dignity. The basic human rights need to be recognized. The second thing is in terms of the intersectional approaches, government needs to seriously take that into consideration. You must do your gender mainstreaming. There's no two hoots about it. We see it in terms of the COVID-19 responses that are so gender blind that unfortunately it creates more problems than it's supposed to alleviate the situation. We already understand the gravity of what it needs to be done, and what is the exclusion, and what is the inequality that we have created. The connection right now is to push forward a framework and work, actually, no more talk, actually act on it, both at every level, whether it's individual level, at your family, at your community, government, and for the SDG, just to respond to your SDG question, those who are working on SDGs will now have to take a new look into the SDG, because people have really, really lost hope where governments are concerned. So this whole issue of sustainability needs a revamp. It needs a recalibration, like I said, recalibration, because it's not working. We need to move forward, and we need to do it fast. Yeah.
I have a question from some of our participants. This question is an open question to our panelists today. How can we improve the women mobilization strategies? How can we empower women? What can be done in this interim? Perhaps I can go to Professor. Are you okay? Sunita, you wanted to answer this? Yes, go ahead.
I think this is a conversation which Helen and I frequently have. In terms of improving the mobilization of women, we have to understand that women organize themselves differently. And we need to get funding to the ground to these women. And we need to appreciate that they work in a different way, that the collaboration is different. We don't have very hierarchical organization that requires, a structure that it's a very masculine kind of structure. So when you want to improve women's mobilization strategy, understand how women organize themselves and get the money to the women, help them, because they're not going to take that and run away and do something else. They really work, and we have a lot of examples on the grounds where when you give women micro financing, how much they improve the community, their families, improve their food security. So the first need in terms of SDGs is also to look at how women organize themselves. And I think that's a very important question that is lacking and is lagging behind.
We're going to hear from Helen right now. Of course, Helen is from the Iban community here in Malaysia, in Sarawak. But Helen, since you're on the line, perhaps you could just share your perspective.
I think my conclusion is not is same with Nita. We need more platform. We need some resources to continue the action to build capacity building among the indigenous women in the rural area. We need a platform. So we can organize some work for indigenous women. I'm sure they are able to address their problem again, and hopefully it's build again their what we call it confidence in protecting their rights and defend their rights. It's very important for us to make sure the indigenous women also participate in all action, not only the men.
I'm going to digress a bit for all our speakers. Although I know the issues are sort of, if changes are going to happen, needs to happen either at the grassroots level or from top to bottom. But if you look at the fourth estate, or what they call the media, what role can the media play to further help bring awareness to the realities of inequality happening within communities as effect of climate change? Anyone can answer. Sunita, perhaps you.
The change of narratives is always important. I think in terms of how they capture narratives,
yes,
very inclusive. And
hello.
You have someone is talking. Sorry. You have this, this pull in terms of binary as to who is more superior or who is better. It's not about who is better. It's about how we can build a cooperative future, collaboration. And I think that's important, because if you look at the rural communities, whether it's a farming or if you go to indigenous communities, cooperation is a very important skill. And right now, even right now, as we build for, as we meet this COVID-19 pandemic, if you look at urban centers, there's also this cooperation that's going on. There's little circles of cooperation, whether you're building a community garden or you're supporting whoever that's in your community to get resources or, buy their grocery or helping them. And so, we are a human family. And I think that we need to recognize that we are all part of one planet. And we are all one species. We are just different in terms of diversity, but the thing is that we are one. So unless we understand that one and work together as one, we are going to pull each other, at every front. So I think the SDGs are important, like what you've highlighted, but I think that it needs to be seen in a very holistic manner rather than what is being done right now in a compartmentalized fashion.
That's right. I'd like to actually bring up a quote right now by Jane Goodall. I think we all know who she is, especially her work with wildlife as well. She says, each one of us matters. We all have a role to play and we all make a difference. Each of us must take responsibility for our own lives and above all, show respect and love for living things around us, especially each other. I have a question coming out from one of our participants, and I think what a great question this is. And this question reads, what actions should men take to best assist women in their actions on gender equality? So whether you are part of the community or working with an NGO outside of the community or working in a high-level corporate, trying to drive your corporation towards a CSR that enables the community, what actions can men take as we talk about gender equality? This is an open question to our entire panel, as I can't really see everyone, but please, everyone, feel free to jump in. I'm going to start with the youngest on the panel. Sophia, you've been quiet for quite some time. Your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important also to recognize that the role men play as protectors, especially in indigenous communities. Men have an inherent role but so do women. And I think it's important to recognize there are two roles, as protectors and as leaders and as healers and as guardians. And if men can leave space for women to lead, that would also make such a big difference on a grassroots level in Indigenous communities. Women tend to be a bit more grounded and tend to intersect all of the issues like we have done on this panel, whether it be about families, about children, about having food on the table and food security. Women are bringing all of that into perspective, and the way that they lead is going to be fundamental in the way that communities can take action. But we do need that male alliance. We do need that male energy when confronting colonial powers and corporations that don't respect grassroots movements, grassroots Indigenous communities that are living on the ground. So we both play a role, and I do think it's really important to listen to each other and to let women lead in times of confrontation, when the times are really heated, and sometimes you get blinded by anger, and the women can lead that perspective of healing and moving forward in a positive way, and also respecting their communities and knowing when it's time to take action and when it's time to sit back.
Thank you, Sophia. Chanda, perhaps you have a perspective to share as well.
Yeah, before this, I just wanted to quickly talk about this media. I think you raised this question because we feel that media plays a very, very important role, like how it projects makes a big difference in terms of like presenting Indigenous peoples. But most of the time, as Sunita said, the narratives are being developed by somebody else who is not really, who has not understood the whole perspective. So that's why it has to be the Indigenous peoples, it has to be women, it has to be youth who should be, developing their own narratives. So in case of media, I think most of the time it's very frustrating also, disappointing also. Most of the mainstream media houses misrepresent Indigenous peoples, and then when their issues are being reported, it's not well captured what exactly the reality is. So that's why most of the time we see they are presented as an exotic, primitive, groups, and more as a showcase for the public. So that's why I think we really are struggling to build our own narratives, how it should be presented. So in terms of gender, I think the roles, I think each of the communities have their own. It's not like Indigenous communities don't have gender disparity, but we feel it's better in terms of, but if you see the customary practices, the customary institutions, still we feel that women are not in the decision-making processes, or they are not, because still, if you talk about the space for for women, I'm not talking about Indigenous women, in general women. So there has always been question about their capacity, the leadership skills, whereas this is not the situation for men. Nobody asks the capacity about men. So that's why I think this is one area that where we need to do it. It's not like women don't have the capacity, they don't get space or enough opportunities to take the lead. So that's one of the thing. And at the same time, I think there is not much investment being made for a women to be empowered, or for women to be taking up that positions, and then recognize their roles and contribution, whether it's in the customary institution, whether it's protection, promotion of the livelihood, traditional livelihood, Indigenous knowledge. So I mean, this is all about recognizing their roles, and then I think men can play a very important role in terms of putting this issues together. So yeah.
Fantastic. I'm going to try and bring in Professor once again if he is available. I think the internet connection at his end is a little bit choppy. So let's see if Professor is here. Does not look like it. So it's an all-women panel now. Why not? Once in a while.
Why not? Yes.
um, Ladies, Mother Nature has a strong message for all of us, and I think while we analyze the key risk factors, the sustainability challenges, we also need to look at, of course, empowering women and looking at women and children's rights as well. Healthcare playing a big part here. Humans and nature are a part of a connected system. Moving forward, and as a summary to today's discussion, we don't have much time. I'd like to go through each one of you, all four of you on the call right now, to tell us how would you summarize today's discussion and what is the outlook, at least for the next 1 month or even 6 months ahead. Sunita, Chanda, since you're here, perhaps we can begin with you. Chanda?
Oh, sorry. I thought Sunita. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's quite a comprehensive and quite diverse discussion. I think you try to bring in all this perspective from different groups and communities. So that's quite good. For us, I think these things are I think somebody also shared, it's not standalone or separate kind of issues. So because they are quite interlinked. So that's why it's very important that no matter which communities you belong, which gender you belong, I think there should be some kind of collective effort, building the solidarity. Because if you see, there is shrinking space for the civil society, like the NGOs and then the communities work that we are doing. So at this time, I think it's very, very important that we build the solidarity, we organize ourselves, no matter whether we are indigenous, non-indigenous, women, youth. So there has to be some kind of collective effort should be built among us to, take forward our effort at all levels.
Absolutely. Sophia?
Yeah, just to echo what Chanda said, exactly that. We need solidarity, whether that's with our indigenous communities across the nation, but also across the globe. We need to echo what we say to each other, and I think this call is a really good way how to do that. Understanding that a lot of our issues are similar, even in different countries, with different governments and just different people. We've never met each other yet. We have pretty similar issues across waters. And I think that, the more indigenous communities talk to each other, recognize the similarities, and recognize that inherent rights that we have, and the role that we play as protectors of our indigenous lands, we can have that solidarity when we are in danger. And that was really clearly seen in Canada when we had a pipeline try to be built on unceded indigenous lands in British Columbia. And we shut down Canada, and we made sure that the government knew that we were not going to stand for that injustice. And it was across Canada. We even had people in the United States taking action. We had people in Europe taking action by non-Indigenous peoples as well. And knowing their role also in the movement as non-Indigenous peoples, putting their lives on the front lines as well, helping us and creating that solidarity in numbers was extremely valuable to Indigenous peoples. So that interconnectedness of all peoples across the world with Indigenous communities and helping us is key in order to solve the climate crisis and all of the other issues that we're facing in it.
Dr. Jones?
The health of the people and the health of the ecosystems, they're both paramount at this point in time. In the next week, two months after, many years after, I think that's the most important that we need to invest on. And we are going only to be able to achieve ecosystems health and human well-being if and when we work together, the media comes together, tell the stories not only the bad ones. You tell the good stories as well. You have a role in all of this. When we talk about integrated approaches, we have to put together all the sectors to work hand in hand, because it's a challenging situation we're in. Pandemic has put a lot of additional pressures to what is already existing. Teach them in, provide them with opportunities. So we look for equity. We need to involve youth, women, and all sectors. I think that every one of us, every little thing that we do can contribute to a better world and more and wealthier and healthier people in this world. So that's my take for the whole night.
I like that, wealthier and healthier. I'm going to bring in Sunita right now, and hopefully Helen is on the line with you, Sunita, at some point to give your summary of today's discussion.
Yeah, well, Helen and I had a very long conversation, and I said before we came on this, so because we knew that she might not be able to have very clear connection. I think one thing that has taught me, and this is very clear in terms of doing this research and being with the women leaders in the indigenous community of Sarawak, is that the strong environmental stewardship that they have. I think the one thing that I took out from doing this, no matter how hard they were going through, they were not waiting for anybody to come and help them or tell them what to do. They were very empowered. They found ways to be resilient, no matter how hard it was. And I think that the one thing all of us can take, and the takeaway right now, is to embrace our environmental stewardship. If we need to have that revolution for next, after, and post-COVID, that revolution begins with internally in terms of our environmental stewardship, because that connection is very, very clear from what we have been facing in the last few months. And if we don't address that intersectionalities and the connections that we have with nature, our well-being is not going to get any better. So if we're going to build better, that has to be the fundamental or the basis of our building block, that environmental stewardship. So if at all this whole conversation about inequality is important, I think as important as it is, it needs to show how rooted our communities are and how invested they are in supporting this environmental stewardship. So let us all come together and make that happen, So that's it from me. And I thank everybody who have stayed on with us for this so short.
Well, our aim was 90 minutes. We've gone, our aim was 60 minutes. Sorry, we've gone to 90 minutes. It's a good sign when the pen you're using has run out of ink. So it means you've taken a lot of notes. A lot of things need to be done. But for all the participants joining on the call today, here's a quick reminder. We've been sharing links as well on the screen, which you can also find after at the ESG TV YouTube link. If you would like to follow these links, support, take action, they're all there for your viewing and clicking pleasure. Also, this is a lead up to the Entrepreneur and Sustainability e-conference happening on the 10th and 11th of September. And the real aim is to make it interactive, empower and humanize these conversations that we're having. Less talk, more action. I think that's the conclusion today. I want to thank all our speakers on the panel. You're calling in from all corners of the globe, from Philippines and Canada and India and Myanmar. Thank you so much for calling in. And I think it's been a long day for many of us. So thank you so much. And we leave with this particular, I guess, feeling and quote or motto from the SDG as well, which is leaving no one behind. So, with that in mind, I would like to close today's session and thank all the participants, all the speakers, all your work silently as silent heroes pays off, it makes a difference. Let's come together, and this is only perhaps the starting point, or to get the ball rolling into these conversations. Let's keep doing it, and you know what? Let's make it the new normal. I'm Jessie Chahel, thanking all of you for being on the conversation today. Let's stay strong and be safe. Speak again
Thank you
soon.
so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.